April 18, 1942, 8:24 a.m. 650 nautical miles east of Japan, Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood on the pitching deck of the USS Hornet and watched waves crash over the bow. The carrier's deck officer gave him the signal. 50 feet. That's how low they'd have to fly. 50 feet above the Pacific, then 50 feet above Tokyo's rooftops. The B-25 Mitchell bomber behind him, a plane designed to take off from 300-foot runways, had 467 feet of carrier deck. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Cole, was 26 years old and had never taken off from a carrier. Neither had Doolittle, neither had any of the 80 men about to try. The math was simple and unforgiving. A fully loaded B-25 weighed 31,000 pounds, standard takeoff speed, 90 mph. The Hornet's deck ended in open air above a dark ocean. If they didn't reach flying speed by the white line painted 50 feet from the edge, gravity would solve the problem permanently. Before we continue with Doolittle's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now, back to the Pacific Ocean, April 18, 1942, where James Doolittle was about to attempt something the Navy said was mathematically impossible. Jimmy Doolittle wasn't supposed to be there. At 45 years old, he was ancient by combat pilot standards. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He'd won the Schneider Trophy, the Bendix Trophy, and broken the transcontinental speed record. He'd pioneered instrument flying, performed the first outside loop, and survived crashes that would have killed lesser pilots. In 1930, he'd walked away from a plane that disintegrated around him at 300 mph. By 1940, he was making $25 a year as a vice president at Shell Oil, more money than most generals. Then December 7, 1941 happened. Doolittle was in Detroit when the news broke. Pearl Harbor burning. 403 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled. He called the Army Air Forces the next morning. He was 45, too old for fighters, too valuable to risk. They told him no 3 times. He called a 4th. He knew people. He'd trained half the pilots in the service. By January 1942, he had his orders. Report to Columbia, South Carolina. Special assignment. Tell nobody. The assignment had a simple premise and an impossible execution. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America was losing everywhere. The Philippines falling, Wake Island gone, Singapore surrendered, Japanese forces advancing through Burma, threatening India. The American public needed hope. President Roosevelt wanted Japan bombed, not nibbled at the edges, but struck in the heart. Tokyo itself. The problem was geography. Japan sat 2,000 miles from the nearest American base. Heavy bombers like the B-17 could reach that distance, but needed 5,000-foot runways that didn't exist in range of Japan. Aircraft carriers could get close, but Navy dive bombers had a 300-mile range, not enough to reach Tokyo and return. The Enterprise and Hornet could launch planes, but there was nowhere to land them afterward. Every option ended in mathematics that killed pilots. Captain Francis Lowe of the Navy had the insane idea first. Use Army bombers. Launch them from a carrier. They'd have the range to reach Tokyo, bomb it, and continue west to China, where they could land at friendly airfields. The Chinese resistance was still fighting. There were maps showing strips near Chuchao. It could work. Except Army bombers weren't designed for carrier operations. They were too heavy, wings too wide, landing gear too weak. The Navy calculated minimum takeoff distances. The numbers came back impossible. A B-25 Mitchell bomber needed 200 feet minimum. The Hornet's deck was 800 feet total, and they'd need at least 300 feet to park planes behind the lead aircraft. That left 500 feet. The Navy shook their heads. Physics said no. That's when someone mentioned Doolittle. He arrived in San Francisco in February 1942 and met with Admiral William Halsey. They showed him the problem. Halsey expected Doolittle to confirm the Navy's assessment. Instead, Doolittle asked one question. "Can you get me within 500 miles of Japan?" Halsey said yes. Doolittle said, "Then I can do it." The next day, Doolittle was at Naval Air Station Alameda, watching a B-25 practice carrier takeoffs. The pilot was Lieutenant John Fitzgerald, an experienced Mitchell pilot from Oklahoma City. Fitzgerald had won 200 hours in B-25s. He rolled the bomber to the white line marking 500 feet. Full flaps, full power. The Wright Cyclone engines screamed. Fitzgerald released the brakes. The B-25 used 467 feet. The Navy officers stood silent. Doolittle was already calculating modifications. Between February 3rd and March 1st, 1942, Doolittle assembled 24 volunteer crews at Eglin Field in Florida. He told them nothing except they'd be flying B-25s on a mission that was dangerous and important. No details. Every man volunteered anyway. They practiced short takeoffs until they could do it blind. 400 feet became routine. 350 became possible. But takeoff was only the first problem. The B-25 Mitchell had a range of 300 miles with a standard payload. Tokyo to the Chinese airfields was 900 miles. Doolittle needed 600 more miles from physics that wasn't there. He started stripping weight. The lower gun turret came out, 225 pounds saved. The liaison radio, 60 pounds gone. They'd navigate by dead reckoning and hope. The co-pilot's seat stayed, but the heavy armor came out. Rubber self-sealing fuel bladders were removed from the wings, too heavy. They'd fly without crash protection and pray they didn't take bullets in the tanks. Then Doolittle added weight in one place, fuel. He installed a collapsible 275-gallon rubber bladder in the crawlway above the bomb bay. Another 160-gallon tank went in the passageway. The top gunner would have to crawl over a fuel tank to reach his position. One spark, one bullet, and the plane would become a fireball. It bought them 435 gallons, almost 600 miles of range. Still not enough. Doolittle did the math again. If they flew at minimum fuel consumption, 165 mm per at 500 feet, they could stretch it. Maybe, if winds were favorable, if they didn't have to deviate, if they found the Chinese airfields in the dark. The B-25s would arrive over China after midnight with empty tanks. They'd be landing at unlit airfields they'd never seen, in mountains at night with no fuel reserves. Lieutenant Thomas Griffin, the navigator on Crew 6, ran the numbers independently. He came to Doolittle's tent at Eglin Field on March 18, 1942. Griffin was 24, from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Before the war, he'd studied engineering. He showed Doolittle his calculations. "Sir, even if everything goes perfectly, we'll be landing with 5 minutes of fuel, maybe less." Doolittle looked at the numbers. "Did you show anyone else?" "No, sir." "Don't." Griffin started to protest. Doolittle cut him off. "Tom, the mission goes forward. The men know the risks. We need this. The country needs this. If you want out, I'll approve the transfer, no questions asked." Griffin thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "I'm in, sir." "Good man. Now help me figure out how to teach these pilots to fly at 50 feet without dying." The low-altitude training nearly killed them before the mission started. Flying at 50 feet means no margin for error, no time to recover from mistakes, no room to pull up if you misjudge. On March 23rd, Lieutenant Miller and his crew were practicing over the Gulf of Mexico. Miller dropped to 40 feet, hit turbulence, and one wing dipped. The tip touched water. The B-25 cartwheeled and exploded. All 5 men died. Their bodies washed up on Pensacola Beach 3 days later. Doolittle watched the funeral. He didn't cancel the training. He made it harder. They flew formations at 50 feet. They flew at 50 feet at dawn and dusk when depth perception failed. They flew at 50 feet in rain. Doolittle led every flight. At 45 years old, he flew lower than men half his age. Once his propeller wash kicked up a waterspout that soaked the plane behind him. The pilot radioed. "Sir, you trying to give us a bath?" Doolittle replied. "Just wanted to see if you'd follow me through a wave." They would. All of them would. On March 25th, Doolittle gathered the crews and finally told them the target. Tokyo. They'd launch from a carrier, bomb the Japanese capital, and fly to China. They'd be landing at night in mountains with no lights, probably out of fuel. Questions? Lieutenant Ted Lawson, pilot of Plane 7 from Redlands, California, asked the only question that mattered. What if we can't make China? Doolittle's answer was direct. Then you ditch in the ocean or bail out over Japan. Either way, your chances aren't good. But you'll have hit Tokyo first. That counts for something. Not one man backed out. What Doolittle didn't tell them was the part that scared him most. The Chinese airfields weren't just unlit. Intelligence was spotty on whether they even existed anymore. The maps were 6 months old. Japanese forces were advancing. The resistance might have fallen back. The fields might be occupied. He'd sent word through channels, asking the Chinese to light fires at the airfields on the night of April 19th. Whether the message would reach the right people was pure chance. They were flying 200 miles to land at airfields that might not be there, guided by fires that might not be lit, with fuel that might run out over mountains in darkness. But first, they had to get the B-25s on a carrier and take off without falling into the ocean. On April 1st, 1942, 16 B-25s landed at Alameda Naval Air Station and taxied directly onto the USS Hornet. The dock workers stared. No one had ever loaded Army bombers onto a carrier before. The B-25's wingspan was 67 feet. The Hornet's flight deck was 80 feet wide. The margin was 13 feet, total. The deck crew measured twice and positioned each plane with ropes and pulleys. They fitted them like puzzle pieces, wings overlapping, tails hanging over the edge. When all 16 were aboard, there were 6 feet between some wing tips. The Navy crew looked at the arrangement and the impossible question hanging in salt air. How the hell do you launch these without the props hitting each other? Doolittle had an answer. Very carefully and in order. The first plane goes, then the second, then the third. No mistakes, no do-overs. The Hornet left San Francisco on April 2nd with 16 B-25s strapped to its deck. Nobody waving goodbye knew where they were going. The sailors didn't know. The bomber crews didn't tell. They sailed west in silence. On April 13th, the Hornet met the USS Enterprise and escorts at a designated point in the Pacific, Task Force 16, commanded by Admiral Halsey. The plan was to sail to 450 miles off Japan, launch at dawn on April 19th, and hit Tokyo in daylight when accuracy would be highest. The B-25s would continue west, arrive over China after dark, but before midnight, and land with at least 30 minutes of fuel remaining, tight but survivable. The Pacific Ocean had different plans. April 18, 1942, 3:10 a.m. The Hornet was still 650 miles from the launch point when the escort ship USS Nashville detected a Japanese picket boat. Radio intercepts confirmed it was transmitting. The Japanese Navy now knew an American carrier force was approaching. Surprise was gone. Japanese fighters and bombers would be airborne within hours. If Task Force 16 continued west, they'd be sailing into a hornet's nest with 16 Army bombers parked on the deck, unable to defend themselves. Admiral Halsey gave the order at 5:58 a.m., launch immediately, 650 miles. That was 200 miles farther than planned. 200 miles that would come off the end of the flight. 200 miles that existed in China, where they'd be flying in the dark, over mountains, with no fuel. The math now said they couldn't make it. Not all of them, maybe none of them. Doolittle got the word at 6:15 a.m. He gathered the crews on the pitching deck with spray coming over the bow. Wind was gusting to 27 knots. The sea was running high. The Hornet was rolling 8 degrees. "We launch in 1 hour," Doolittle shouted over the wind, 650 miles out. That's the bad news. The good news is the wind gives us extra lift. The bad news is if you screw up the takeoff, the waves will kill you before you drown. Someone, probably Lieutenant Dick Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, yelled back, "What's the good news again, sir?" "You'll be too busy to think about it. Check your planes. We leave at 8. At 7:25 a.m., Lieutenant Henry Miller, the deck officer, not the pilot who died in training, positioned Doolittle's plane at the launch line, 50 feet from the edge. The white line said, "This is where your luck runs out if you're not fast enough." The Hornet turned into the wind. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit. Cole settled into the co-pilot seat. The bombardier, Sergeant Fred Bramer from Seattle, was already in the nose. Navigator Lieutenant Hank Potter from Pierre, South Dakota, checked his maps one last time. Gunner Sergeant Paul Leonard from Denver loaded the .50 caliber. Everyone knew the extra fuel meant they were carrying a bomb surrounded by gasoline. Don't think about it. Doolittle ran the checklist. Fuel, full plus the extra bladders. Payload, 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high explosive and 1 incendiary cluster. Weight, 31,000 pounds. Wind, 27 knots down the deck. Pitch, the carrier deck rising and falling with ocean swells. Flaps, full. Props, full. He looked at Cole. Ready? Cole nodded. His hands were steady. He was 26 and about to do something no Army pilot had ever done. Doolittle was 45 and about to do something everyone said was impossible. The deck officer began the launch sequence. Right hand twirling overhead, engines to full power. The right cyclones screamed. The B-25 shook against the wheel chocks, left hand pointing forward, release brakes. The deck officer dropped to his knees and pointed down the deck as he fell. The carrier's bow was dropping into a trough. Go now. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 rolled forward, gathering speed, 40 feet, 50 feet. The Hornet's bow was rising now, pitching up as a swell lifted it. 100 feet, 150. The white line passed under them. 200 feet. Not fast enough. 300. Cole's hand tensed on the control column. 400 feet. The wind was in their face, the deck pitching up. 450 feet. The B-25 lifted off with 17 feet of deck remaining. For 1 second, exactly 1 second, they were airborne with no speed, no altitude, hanging in wind and hope. The Pacific Ocean waited below. Then the nose dipped, they picked up speed, and the right cyclones grabbed air. Doolittle banked left, circled the Hornet once, and turned west toward Japan. Behind him, 15 more B-25s would make the same run. The crews watched Doolittle's takeoff, saw the 17 feet he had left, and understood exactly how precise they'd need to be. Lieutenant Hoover in Plane 2 used 445 feet. Lieutenant Gray in 3 used 467. Lieutenant Hallmark in 4 nearly didn't make it. His left wheel was 6 feet from the edge when he lifted off. By 8:24 a.m., all 16 B-25s were airborne. Not one had gone into the ocean. Task Force 16 turned around and ran east at flank speed before Japanese bombers could arrive. The 16 B-25s formed into loose groups and headed west at 200 feet. They dropped lower, 100 feet, 50 feet, close enough to see whitecaps, close enough that if anyone misjudged, they'd cartwheel and explode before they could radio. They flew in silence, watching the horizon, watching fuel gauges, watching for Japanese fighters. At 12:15 p.m., they spotted the Japanese coast. Lieutenant Cole, in Doolittle's plane, marked it in the log. Land ho. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. Doolittle descended to 50 feet and accelerated to 225 mph. The extra speed burned fuel they didn't have, but made them harder targets. They came in over a small fishing village. People waved. They thought the B-25s were Japanese. The Army Air Force's star insignia looked similar enough at 50 feet and 225 mph. Some civilians kept waving until they saw the bombs. At 12:30 p.m., Tokyo appeared ahead, a grey sprawl of factories, docks, and residential districts. Air raid sirens weren't sounding. No fighters scrambled. Japan had never been bombed. Their defenses pointed outward, not up at their own sky. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the home islands felt safe. Doolittle climbed to 500 feet, high enough for the bombs to arm, low enough to be accurate. He came in from the north over Tokyo Bay. The bombardier, Sergeant Bramer, called targets. Factory buildings, warehouses, power stations. At 12:36 p.m., the first bomb bay opened. 4 500-pound bombs dropped. 3 seconds later, they detonated in a factory complex in the Koto ward. The people of Tokyo looked up and saw American bombers. Impossible. There were no American bases within range. There were no carriers close enough. Yet the bombs were falling, marching across industrial districts in neat lines of destruction and fire. Plane 2, Lieutenant Hoover, hit an oil tank farm. Plane 3, Lieutenant Gray, struck a steel mill. Plane 4, Lieutenant Hallmark, bombed a power station. Plane 5, Captain York, hit the Sheba ward. Plane 6, Lieutenant Lawson, bombed the industrial waterfront. Plane 7, Lieutenant Greening, struck manufacturing plants in the Oshiage district. Every 30 seconds, another B-25 appeared, dropped its bombs, and vanished toward the horizon. The Japanese response was chaos. Air raid sirens finally wailed at 12:40, 10 minutes late. Fighters scrambled from airfields but couldn't find targets. The B-25s were already gone, racing west at 50 feet where radar couldn't track them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky but hit nothing. Some shells fell back into Tokyo's streets, killing civilians. The city burned. 16 planes, 64 bombs, 12 minutes over target, industrial facilities destroyed, civilians killed. Estimates ranged from 50 to several hundred. One bomb hit a school, killing children. Another destroyed a hospital. Doolittle would think about those deaths for the rest of his life, but in the moment, he was focused on one thing: fuel. By 1:00 p.m., all 16 B-25s were over open ocean, heading for China. Fuel gauges showed the situation exactly as predicted. They wouldn't make it. The extra 200 miles meant they'd run dry over mountains in darkness, with no airfields close enough. The question wasn't if they'd crash, it was how many would survive the crashes. At 7:30 p.m., with twilight fading, Doolittle's plane crossed the Chinese coast. Fuel gauges read empty, but the engines kept running on vapor. Potter, the navigator, searched for landmarks. Nothing matched the maps. Cloud cover obscured the ground. No fires marked the airfields. Either the message hadn't reached the Chinese resistance, or the Japanese had advanced, or they were in the wrong place. At 8:15 p.m., the fuel gauges hit zero. The engines were running on fumes. At 8:20 p.m., they started coughing. Doolittle climbed to 6,000 feet and gave the order: bail out. One by one, the crew jumped into darkness over mountains they couldn't see. Cole went first, then Bramer, then Potter, then Leonard. Doolittle went last. He stood at the hatch and watched his plane, the first B-25 to take off from a carrier, the first to bomb Tokyo, fly itself into Chinese darkness with empty tanks. Then he jumped. His parachute opened. He landed in a rice paddy at 8:47 p.m., soaking wet and alive. The B-25 crashed into a mountain 6 miles away. Of the 16 planes, all were lost. 11 crews bailed out over China. 1 landed in the Soviet Union and was interned. 4 crashed. Crew 6, Lieutenant Hallmark's plane, crashed into the ocean off the Chinese coast. 2 men drowned. The remaining 3 were captured by Japanese forces occupying the area. Crew 16, Captain Farrow's plane, also crashed on landing. The entire crew was captured. 8 raiders were captured total. The Japanese executed 3 after-show trials for war crimes bombing civilians. Lieutenant Hallmark, Lieutenant Farrow, and Sergeant Spatz were tied to crosses and shot on October 15, 1942. A 4th, Corporal Mader, died of disease in captivity. The other 4 survived 40 months of starvation and torture in Chinese prison camps. 73 men survived and evaded capture. Chinese civilians and resistance fighters rescued them, hiding them from Japanese search parties. 1 crew landed in Soviet territory and was interned but treated well. They escaped a year later through Iran. Doolittle landed in a rice paddy, was found by Chinese farmers who couldn't believe he'd come from the sky, and was eventually reunited with his crew. He was certain he'd be court-martialed. He'd lost all 16 aircraft. 3 men were dead, 8 captured. 0 planes returned. By military accounting, the raid was a disaster. He wrote in his diary, "I have failed." The United States government disagreed. Doolittle was promoted 2 grades to brigadier general, skipping colonel entirely. He received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt. Every surviving raider was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The mission was declared a complete success. The military assessment wasn't about bombs or industrial damage. 16 B-25s carrying 64 bombs couldn't meaningfully hurt Japan's war machine. The factories would be repaired in weeks. The tactical impact was negligible. But the psychological impact was total. Japan had told its people the home islands were invulnerable. Then American bombers appeared over Tokyo in daylight and left. The myth of invulnerability shattered. Japanese military leadership panicked. They'd been planning to extend their perimeter further into the Pacific, but now they had to defend the home islands. They withdrew fighters and ships from offensive operations to protect Japan itself. More critically, the raid forced Japan's hand at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto became obsessed with destroying the American carriers before they could launch more raids. He pushed for the Midway operation, an attempt to lure the U.S. fleet into a decisive battle. At Midway, 6 weeks later, Japan lost 4 carriers and the initiative in the Pacific War. The strategic trajectory shifted because Yamamoto couldn't tolerate the threat of more raids on Tokyo. 16 B-25s changed the course of the war by making Japan defend when it should have attacked. In America, the effect was instantaneous. 4 months of defeat and retreat ended with news that Tokyo had been bombed. Newspapers ran headlines: "Japan bombed." Morale soared. War bond sales jumped 27% in 1 week. Recruitment offices had lines around the block. The country needed a win. Doolittle gave them one. But Doolittle never spoke about his role. After the war, he downplayed his part relentlessly. When asked about the raid, he talked about the crews, the Navy, the Chinese who rescued his men. He never mentioned the calculations, the modifications, the training, the moment standing on the Hornet's deck when he released the brakes with 50 feet of runway and 31,000 pounds of airplane. He returned to the European theatre, commanded the 8th Air Force, and helped plan the D-Day air operations. He retired as a lieutenant general in 1959. Then he went back to being Jimmy Doolittle from Alameda, California. He worked for Shell Oil again. He sat on corporate boards. He wore suits to meetings and never mentioned the war unless asked directly. The raiders, the surviving ones, met every year at reunions. They had a tradition. Someone would bring a bottle of Hennessy cognac from 1896, the year Doolittle was born. Each year, they'd open it and toast the men who didn't make it home. The bottle had engraved silver cups for each raider. When a man died, his cup would be turned upside down. The reunions grew smaller. Men died. World War II became history, then distant history, then something only the very old remembered. By 2013, only 4 raiders remained. They held their final reunion at the Air Force Museum in Ohio. They opened the 1896 cognac. They turned the cups upside down for the men who were gone. Then they drank, and the bottle was empty. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot who sat in the right seat when they took off from the Hornet with 50 feet to spare, was the last raider alive. He died on April 9, 2019, at age 103. He'd never sought recognition. After the war, he flew cargo planes, retired from the Air Force as a colonel, and lived in Comfort, Texas. His obituary mentioned he'd been on the Tokyo raid, but most of his neighbors never knew. Doolittle died on September 27, 1993, at age 96. His funeral was quiet. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery with full honors, but the ceremony emphasized his post-war work, corporations, boards, advisory positions. The Tokyo raid was mentioned, but briefly. It was 51 years old by then. Ancient history. A footnote about bombers and carriers. What the eulogies didn't say, James Doolittle looked at a problem everyone called impossible, launching Army bombers from a carrier to bomb a target 2,000 miles away, and solved it with fuel bladders, weight reduction, and math. He taught 80 men to take off in 450 feet. He led them from a carrier deck to Tokyo and back. He turned 16 B-25s into low-altitude demons that flew 50 feet above the ocean, bombed the Japanese capital, and vanished. 73 of his men made it home. That's what mattered to him. Not the medals, not the promotion, not the impact on grand strategy. 73 of his men made it home because he did the math right. There's a memorial at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. It's small, a room with photographs, maps, and artifacts. The engraved silver cups from the raiders' reunions sit in a glass case. Most are turned upside down now. The 1896 cognac bottle is empty beside them. Visitors walk through, read the plaques, and leave. But if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear it. The sound of Wright Cyclone engines at full power, the deck officer's final signal, and the moment when 31,000 pounds of B-25 Mitchell bomber lifted off from the USS Hornet with 17 feet of deck to spare and turned west toward Tokyo. 73 men came home. That's the only number that mattered. If this story moved you, hit that like button. These missions succeeded because men like Doolittle refused to accept impossible as an answer. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing these forgotten stories of courage and innovation. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Do you have a connection to World War II? Did someone in your family serve? We want to hear from you. Thank you for keeping these heroes alive.